Good morning and welcome to the Memoir and Nonfiction panel for the Deep Valley Book Festival. We're happy to have you here watching us and listening to the topics that we'll talk about that revolve around memoir and nonfiction writing specifically. I'm Rachel Hannell. I'm the moderator for this program this morning. And I have 5 authors with me today, so I'll be asking them questions and they'll be answering questions, and they'll also be telling us a little bit more about themselves. So I'll just give a brief introduction of everyone, and then we'll go around and let people introduce themselves a little more fully, let us know about the books they've written and that type of thing. So I'll start in alphabetical order. I'll start with Christine Bauer. Christine is a writer and communications professional living in Minneapolis. Those 3 words, A Birth Mother Story of Choice, Chance, and Motherhood, is her first book and a labor of love that took decades to complete. I hear you there, Christine. Phyllis Koldai. Phyllis began pecking away on an old manual typewriter in childhood and never stopped. She has authored or edited 10 books in multiple genres. Her latest book is For the Sake of One We Love and Are Losing, a meditative poem and journal. Other recent titles include Beneath the Same Stars, a novel of the 1862 U.S. Dakota War, and Poetry of Presence, an anthology of mindfulness poems with Ruby Wilson. Mary Lozier. Mary lives in St. Paul, where she writes innovative nonfiction for kids. Her most recent book, Isaac the Alchemist, Secrets of Isaac Newton Revealed, is the story of a magic-seeking boy who grows up to be the world's greatest alchemist and also discovers the laws of the universe. Joy Riggs. Joy is the author of Crackerjack Bands and Hometown Boosters, the story of a Minnesota music man. Her award-winning columns, essays, and articles have appeared in numerous publications, including the Star Tribune, Minnesota Parent, and the Des Moines Register. And Jonathan Sweet. Jonathan is an award-winning journalist, the author of 6 books, the ghostwriter of a few more, and has contributed to or edited more than 25 anthologies and collections. In 2019, he founded Brick Pickle Pulp, which is really fun to say, which publishes books in the classic pulp style. He is also the host of the weekly Pulp Nostalgia audiocast, and in 2020 was named to the Who's Who in New Pulp. So we have quite a diverse group here of people who have done a lot of different types of nonfiction writing. So I'm excited to ask them some questions and talk more about this form. But first, I would just like to go around and for all of you to just talk a little bit more about yourself. I just gave you a super brief introduction. So if you want to tell us where you live, if you have a book that you want to show us, if you want to hold up to the camera, feel free to do that. And I'll just start by going around in alphabetical order again. So Christine, what more would you want to say about yourself and your writing?
So as you mentioned, those 3 words, A Birth Mother Story of Choice, Chance, and Motherhood, is my first book. It did take literally decades to finish. So any authors out there who are working on a book, don't give up. It was truly a labor of love and just an important story that I wanted to tell. So I have always really been in the nonfiction arena and trained as a journalist. I actually went to Mankato State University and got my journalism public relations degree and have worked in communications my entire career. So I do communications at my day job, and then other writing on the side. And I have also, I've had opinion pieces and other pieces published in the Star Tribune, University of Minnesota Alumni Magazine, numerous blogs. And that's really where I feel most comfortable in my space, is the nonfiction writing. But glad to be here, and I wish we were doing this in person, but this works too.
Yes, whatever it takes, right?
Yes.
And Phyllis, what more would you like to say about yourself and your writing?
Well, hello everybody, and I am coming to you from Brookings, South Dakota. Normally, I don't get to attend this festival because it's usually held the same weekend as the South Dakota Festival of Books. So this is one benefit for me, though I would like to be there in person. We get to gather in this way. I've written quite a number of books in different genres. I kind of wait for projects to pick me, so I never know exactly what I'm going to be doing next. But I'll just highlight a couple of books, and you can learn about the rest of my work at phylliscoldye.com. I highlight my novel, Beneath the Same Stars, because this is based on true events pertaining to the 1862 U.S. Dakota War, also known as the Sioux Uprising or the Dakota Conflict. So it might be of particular interest to this conference. But since we're talking about memoir today, I will also highlight The Emptiness of Our Hands, which is a spiritual memoir based on 47 days that I lived by choice with my co-author, James Murray, on the streets of Columbus, Ohio, the nation's 15th largest city, and it was my home at the time. There is a companion volume to this that is a free ebook that I wrote on the 10th anniversary of these events. So it gives a little different perspective on things, and that's called Practicing Presence: Insights from the Streets. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. How about you, Mary?
Well, I like to talk about Isaac the Alchemist, which is my latest book. I'm excited about it. I started writing it when I learned that Isaac Newton as a child had written a little secret notebook. And in that notebook, he'd written down the names of books or excerpts from books that he'd read as a child. And now you can go online and see those books. And so, I started seeing the illustrations from the books that he'd read. And so here's the man who grows up to figure out how to shoot rockets to the moon. But as a child, this is what he's reading. So I also knew that he'd grown up to be an alchemist, which I thought would interest kids. So I guess in these COVID times, I know kids are looking for things to read, and I hope that more kids might find this book. One of the other things I've done in connection with this book is I have a little traveling, or had a little traveling alchemy and science show where I would do little experiments, but I would do them the same kind of things that kids now do. But if you take the ingredients and you mark them with like the alchemist symbols, you start seeing what a mystery chemistry was in the old days to the alchemists. So you can take cabbage water that's purple and you can add vinegar, which you can mark with and then it'll change color. And you think, well, gold, they thought they could change lead to gold. Well, there's a reason why they thought they could change lead to gold. And then I'd sort of follow his journey, to discovering that light, which is clear, is actually amazingly enough. And in his day, people believed in magic. You could be hung for a witch, and this huge transition. So I'm excited. So I show kids, prisms, and I have prisms in my own house too that I love looking at. The other book they want to talk about is called The Fairy Ring, or Elsie and Francis Fool the World. I don't know if any of you have seen that photograph before. If you Google Cottingley fairy photographs, it will come out right away. But I got the idea for this book when I was in a bookstore and I saw a book by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, the world's greatest detective, who wrote a book called The Coming of the Fairies. And The Coming of the Fairies was all about how these photographs were real. And the reason he thought they were real was because the two girls were little village girls and they would not be smart enough to take these photographs and fool him. So I thought, well, who were these girls and what is their story? So so this is the story told from their point of view. And one marvelous thing happened was while I was writing it, one of the girls, not this one, but the other one who took the photographs, her daughter self-published her mother's memoir. So I could see the whole story from Elsie, one of the girls' point of view. So anyway, those are the two narrative nonfiction books that I want to talk about. And it's great to be here. Thanks for listening.
Sure, thank you. Is that second book also aimed at children?
It is, yeah. Both of them are for middle grade readers, like
Okay.
10 and up.
Okay, great, thank you. And Joy, I assume you're going to tell us who's standing there behind you over your shoulder.
Yes, I have a guest today with me. My great-grandfather, Jalva Riggs, is behind me. He's kind of the star of the show on the front cover here too, much older. That was back in the turn of the century, and this is about 1945, 42, somewhere in there. So I, like Christine, I have one book so far that was a labor of love. It took me more than 12 years probably. My youngest, I have 3 kids, and my youngest was in kindergarten when I started the project that became a book. Didn't know at the time it would be a book, and then he's now in his 2nd year of college. So my book, Crackerjack Bands and Hometown Boosters, is about the life of my great-grandfather, who was a real-life music man in Minnesota. I didn't know much of anything about him until I was just going to help my dad with a little research project, and then the more I got into it, the more interested I was in not just finding out a little bit about the St. Cloud history, which is where he was a director for about 20 years, but like what else he had done in his life. And then my great grandmother, who was also a musician, and so one thing kind of fed into the other. And so my background is in journalism. I went to Drake University in Des Moines. I grew up in Alexandria, went to school in Des Moines, and so I'd written a lot of short things, but never anything very long. And so it's exciting to have a book out. It came out about a year ago, and yeah, I think the encouragement for people to keep at it is I highly endorse that, because it's so gratifying to be able to share once something you have out there. And I really write to be read. I as a journalist, and then also now I'm kind of a freelance writer and editor, and so I write a lot of essays, and I love the reactions you get from readers, and the things that that brings up for them, and the connections that you make. So that's been a lot of fun. And I haven't been out much since COVID with the book thing, and so I'm really grateful to Rachel and people behind the festival to have this opportunity to talk to readers in a different way.
Great, good, thank you. And Jonathan.
Yes. So yes, Jonathan Sweet. I live in Chaska, which is just southwest of Minneapolis. I write both fiction and nonfiction. For the purposes of this panel, I've written 4 nonfiction books. Probably of most interest to the attendees of Deep Valley would be this one, as we try to hold it right with the Zoom camera. There we go. It's Minnesota's 50 Greatest Baseball Players. It's a look at great players who played at every level in the state. So the minor leagues, some of the old Negro League teams that played here, and things like that, all the way up to the Twins, of course. And then I've also written 2 nonfiction guides to the pulp fiction genre, as we talked about on my intro. Those are right here, Beginner's Guide to Pulp Fiction, Volume 1 and Volume 2. And those are probably my best selling books, kind of nationally, that sell well on Amazon and that sort of thing. But otherwise, I also have written some introductions to different pulp fiction collections and that sort of thing. And like several of the other people, I have a background in journalism, and that's kind of what drew me to that nonfiction genre.
All right, thank you. Well, journalists. At least we tend to have we can sit down and write, every day, right? So I would ask you, and you don't all need to answer this question, but if somebody has kind of a burning desire to answer it, go ahead. I would like to know what led you to write in this genre? What led you to write fiction or nonfiction?
I'll go ahead and go. So my story is a memoir about being a birth mother. So that some people don't know what that means. So that means I had a baby that I placed for adoption. So I chose another family to raise her, and this was a life-altering decision and choice. And so, I mean, it really had to be, I felt like it had to be told in that manner. I mean, I wanted it to be real life, and really I based it on not only memory, but a lot of journals. I journaled throughout the years, and then there were historic events that happened along that line. And so that's why, you know, it was like, this is true, and that's how I have to tell this story. And then as far as other writing goes, we all, you know, journalism is, I think there's that need to tell real stories about real people. So my other writing that I've had published, and these were mostly on the Star Tribune, were related to mental health issues. I had a nephew that had some serious mental health issues, and then he actually passed away of an opioid related overdose. So a lot of things that tie into societal issues, parenting issues, and again, just lend themselves. There's all these great, sad, true stories out there to be told. And so for me, that's just my natural go-to is real stories and real people.
And just to kind of follow up on that, and whoever wants to talk about this next, is just this idea of true stories, you know, and certainly you do hear about a lot of novelists take a real event and then they create a novel out of it. They create a fiction out of it. But, you know, for all of you, you have decided to not do that. You've decided to say, no, this needs to be told as a true story. So if somebody wants to weigh in on that, you know, why do you want to tell these stories as true and not fictionalize them?
I know I was a journalist too, so I was drawn to fiction. I worked for Minnesota Public Radio as a reporter for 20 years, and at one point this book here I wrote I was covering a story that went on for a long time. It had to do with some people who were protesting a highway that they felt would destroy some trees sacred to Native Americans. And so I admire nonfiction novels, and I'd read Friday Night Lights, which I really, you know, about football in Texas, which I really admired, even though I don't care at all about football. And so I was covering the story that it seemed like it was more than a story, just a daily story that you could report on the news. And so I wrote this book about it. And what I found was sometimes as I wrote the book, if I didn't know something, I'd be tempted to say, sort of fudge it a little bit, but then my journalist would say, no. And then you call them up, you call the person up. And when you actually find the real story, it's much more interesting than anything that I could make up. And that's one thing I love about nonfiction. Another thing I love about nonfiction is, like, when you read a novel, okay, that's all there is to that you'll ever know about that person. But if it's a nonfiction, that person will sometimes appear in other places. You'll see connections. You know, Arthur Conan Doyle will be here and there, or other people that I've written about. You'll see these connections that make the world real to you. And that's another thing I love about nonfiction.
Great, thank you.
I think for me, a lot of it is that, again, that journalistic experience where, because over the years, I started doing the math the other day, I've probably written millions of words of nonfiction as a journalist, right? So it comes so much more natural to me. I enjoy writing the fiction, but that is more of it's more work, I guess, for me. And not that it isn't a good experience, but in the end, writing that nonfiction and the truth, I guess, is an easier process for me.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And another question that I have for those of you writing nonfiction, what's your biggest challenge in writing nonfiction? And then maybe also on the opposite part of that, what's your biggest joy? So maybe Phyllis, do you want to weigh in on that? What do you find maybe challenge, especially as somebody who's written in other genres, what do you find most challenging about writing nonfiction?
Yeah, let me switch gears in my head. There was a lot I wanted to say on the last question too. It's a really rich conversation. You know, I think to ground my response in the emptiness of our hands, I had lived, you know, without a home voluntarily for 47 days. And when I came home with my co-author, we were both very damaged. We were mentally unwell. We were physically unwell. And so we came home on April 1st. We did not begin to write about the experience until the end of October. And when we began to write, it was in some ways helpful because it was therapeutic to revisit events that had traumatized us, and also to remember the good things that had happened in our experience, and to enlist our story in the service of higher good, which was trying to acquaint our readers with some of the realities that people face when they're living without a home, and to try to call people to a greater sense of mindfulness in relation to all their relationships, not just to those around them who may be without secure housing. So that was really important, to have that therapy, but it was also very hard. And so it cut both ways on that. And I think, though, the writing was the beginning step of our moving back into something we could call normal. Because for me, writing is my life, and to be able to pick up the pen again and actually feel like I could create something made me feel like I could regain some sense of self.
Good, thank you.
I think one of the challenges for me in writing nonfiction, and Rachel, this might resonate with you, as I love doing research. And so, like, when do you stop doing research? Because at some point you have to do the writing. And so, but on the flip side of that, I think the joy of nonfiction is just finding out new things. I love to learn, and so always learning new things. And so with my book, I grew up in a family. My dad has been a musician all my life. I was in bands. I had no idea. I mean, I just kind of figured bands were always around. Schools always taught music. No, they didn't. And then I learned not only that, but that my great-grandfather was very much involved in the whole transition of community bands to school bands. And so, if I hadn't started doing a little digging around, I wouldn't, understand how important music, why it's so important to people, and just this breadth of knowledge I gained. And so, but knowing when to stop, it's, I could still be researching now. And sometimes I do find out new things, but yeah, that's the challenge and the joy.
And Mary, it looks like that resonated with you.
Oh, yeah.
The idea of
I
research.
sometimes feel I do a ridiculous amount of research, ridiculous. And then if you're writing for kids, you have to, one of the hardest things is deciding what to leave out. I mean, it's the art of leaving things out and making it move forward, but then keeping all the detail that you need to make it real. And then there are times where you just have holes. You just have, there's nothing you can, that's written. So you have to just think and think and think, like put the puzzle pieces together. And you can't, if you force them, it won't work. It has to be what really happened. But sometimes you can figure out what really happened, in the way people do in a courtroom or something. You have to figure it out. And I mean, one thing, I have tried to write fiction, but the problem is that there's so many things you can do in the plot. You can do whatever you want in the plot in fiction, whereas in nonfiction, your plot, how you present it is not set, but the plot itself, you can't make, anything happen that didn't happen. So it's a different challenge, but one I seem to do better at than fiction.
Yeah, the kind of that big wide open space of being able to make up anything you want is very intimidating to me. I would much rather have kind of this clear story that exists out there, and like you said, Mary, it's like a puzzle. Like I it's out there at least it's there. I just have to kind of dig and figure out how to best say it. But on that note, something else I'd like to talk about is this idea of truth in nonfiction, and especially for those of us who had spent time as journalists and have been trained as journalists. I mean, that's really the sacred piece, right? Is you got to tell the truth. But when you're writing creative nonfiction, there's a big difference between kind of this dry report, chronologically, here's what happened, and trying to make a story, a true story, like a story, something that people are going to want to read, and that might require artistic choices. And nonfiction writers are on the whole spectrum. There's some who are extremely journalistic about their approach, even with book length projects. And there's others who are like, you know what, if I need to kind of fudge this little detail to make it sound better, I'm going to do that. And Mary, I think of you because you're writing for children. So you can't just, give them a newspaper report and expect them to want to be able to read it.
I think there are a lot of creative choices that you have that do not involve fudging the facts. I mean, you can choose your point of view. You can choose the order in which things are presented. You can't change the order in which they happen, but you can build suspense by, like, just in a murder mystery, you keep things back until later. I sort of shy away from calling what I do creative nonfiction, even though I think it is creative, because people, for that very reason, people think, oh, well, it's a docudrama, it's okay to say that this happened when it didn't. And it's like, no, it's not. In my book, it's not okay to say something that didn't happen. And you should use primary sources, and you should, that's what you should do, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyone else want to talk about that aspect?
I'd say I, as a journalist, really brought that into my writing. My book alternates chapters between me kind of finding things out about my family history, and then telling the story of my great-grandparents chronologically through their life. And so I interviewed several men who had played in bands for my great-grandfather. So, recorded all those. It was very, like quotes in the book are things that were said. They're not, made up, or things with scenes with my mom and dad. I was taking notes when we were doing these trips and things. So that was all there. When I was doing the history chapters, really trying to make them, that whole creative, the way you're crafting it, to keep people interested in the story and seeing my great-grandparents as characters, and so what are their motivations, and so bringing all those pieces into it, but not creating anything that wasn't there. And if there were things I didn't know, there were a few like, maybe he was thinking this, but never like I knew he was thinking this, because I don't, and I could be wrong, but I've spent enough time looking through old newspaper articles, letters, all that. I felt like I really got a good sense of his character, and then from talking to people who knew him, but it's not the same. And so I wouldn't want to put out there that it was something I didn't know for sure to be true.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's tough because a lot of times, I think, based on what all of us are talking about, we write about, it's not always firsthand knowledge, or, I run into the struggle with my books I've written about pulp fiction. Basically kind of the age of pulp fiction ended shortly after World War II. So there's people still around who worked in that. There's fewer every day. So even though you can talk to a few of those people, you're mostly relying on things that were written, maybe books they wrote, which was relying on their memory and different things along the way. And to the point where there's places in both pulp fiction books where I said, hey, there are two versions of this story. And I said, here's what one person wrote, here's what one person wrote, and we don't know which is true because they're both gone.
Yeah, the memory piece of it was huge for me. And as I was working on my book, it was really important to me that I was remembering things correctly. And so I did have my family members and my daughter's parents read it and make sure that I was remembering correctly. And just because, and I think you have a question maybe later on about that, and because it was sensitive to family members. And so that was really important to me, that I made sure everybody felt comfortable with it. And because I wanted to make sure it was accurate as possible, and just be feel confident about it and feel good about it. And because memory, yeah, everybody can look at a different situation and a point in time very differently.
So for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm glad that you said that about family, because I did want to talk a little bit about that for those of you who have written books that are more family oriented, or that are about family. You know, as somebody who's written a memoir about family, it's such a popular question. I mean, almost every book talk that I give, somebody says, well, what did your family think? Or did you show it to your family, or things like that? So how do you deal with that, with family sensitivities? I know a lot of people would love to write family stories, and I've also heard a lot of them say, oh, but I worry about what so-and-so is going to say, or how my mom or dad or whoever's going to react. And I think it really limits people, you know, from just getting out, from just, you know, writing their stuff down. So how do you deal with, you know, writing about real people who might have feelings about what you're writing?
I didn't write about my family per se, but I developed familial relationships with a lot of the street people that I lived among. And the question of truth telling was an issue from the beginning, because if I had announced to people that I wasn't actually homeless, and that I was actually, you know, going to be writing a book, I could have put my life in jeopardy. And so for that and many other reasons, you know, James and I we were not forthcoming about why we were there. We did not lie, but we also knew that there were certain things that we would never write about. And James also constructed cameras out of trash, pinhole cameras, and took pictures. A lot of elementary school students, you know, experiment with pinhole photography. And but we had rules. You know, he could not take pictures of people. He could not take pictures of anybody's home, you know. And so we were constantly negotiating this line. But as it turns out, people who live on the streets are always negotiating that line anyway. How much do I self-reveal? How much do I withhold for the sake of my survival? When it came time to write, James and I disguised the identities of the people that we wrote about, unless they were people of public record, like government officials, charitable organization directors, and so on. We felt like we could name those people if we had had interactions with them. But this notion of how much to reveal was also always foremost in our minds. And even though we worked hard at trying to protect the most immediate camps around where we ended up building our camp, we were informed in the year after we published the first edition of the book that some people had tried to figure out, some of the readers had tried to figure out exactly where they were living, and were guiding tours out there along with reading our book, which was never our intention and is very intrusive, you know, to those people. So it was an unintended consequence. So yeah, this is an issue that I know well.
Sure. How about others?
I think that's why I write about people that I've never known, who've been dead a long time.
Sure.
Although it's funny, in this one book I did write about real people in real time. It was funny what people got mad about later. I remember there was one young activist guy, and I wrote that he had curly eyelashes, and I found out later he was throbbing mad about that. He hated his eyelashes.
Oh.
I said he had curly eyelashes, long curly eyelashes. I said. So anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, it is surprising what people will pick out, and it's something that you would just least expect, it always seems. And so, Christine, it sounds like you worked pretty closely with the people who are in your book.
Yes, yeah. And as I mentioned earlier, I spent a lot of time working on it. And I did it, you know, I think when I first started, it was just therapy, and I had kept journals. And then I was like, no, this is a really good story I want to share, because my adoption journey, I mean, I couldn't be more blessed with my daughter. I have my daughter in my life. I was there for the birth of my grandchild. I mean, all these wonderful things. So I did, yeah, felt that I needed to, they were such a big part of the story that was a key piece of it too. Yeah, yeah.
And Joy, I know that you also worked with family members as you were working on the book.
I did. My kids are kind of used to me writing about them because I used to be the Minnesota parent, tween, and teen columnist, and so I kind of write about things that they were, doing that led to like, let's find out from experts how we should handle this situation. But so I didn't, I didn't show them what I was doing necessarily. And my husband, I offered, like, you're in the book, do you want to read it? It's like, no, I'll read it when it comes out. But it wasn't anything, sensitive. It was, they're in it as characters, but, And my parents as well, my dad is kind of a main character for the chapters about me. And there was one scene where early on in the research, he and I were, I recorded an interview with him and I was having him listen to it before I put it out like as a podcast. And so during the interview, listening to the interview, he kind of broke down, and there's a scene in my book about this, like, oh my gosh, what's wrong? And then he was just so happy that I was doing this. And so I didn't show that scene to him. And then when I was still in the process of writing the book, I got a grant from the Southwest Minnesota Arts Council, and so I had this event where I was reading sections of the book in progress, and so my parents were there for that, and so I was like, well, I'm gonna read it, and he'll be surprised, hopefully he'll be okay with it, and he was. So I think part of it is just really your intent. If you're writing with empathy and you're writing with like love for the person or understanding of who they are, and you're not out to like settle some kind of score. I think most people really love the fact that you're including them in your book. And so yeah, if there were situations where I was concerned, I would have. In fact, the last couple chapters is about my friendship with a man named Ted Papermaster. And so I did, before the book came out, I sent those chapters to his daughter because I wanted her to know what I had done with. I mean, she knew I'd been visiting him and interviewing him, and that I was writing a book and all that. But just so she kind of knew, had a heads up of, and she, was so supportive. And so yeah, I think people appreciate having their stories told if you're doing it in a responsible way.
Mm-hmm. And oftentimes I will come across people who just seem to kind of jump the gun, like they're worried about what their mom is going to think, and they haven't even written a word yet. They just immediately kind of picture the book on the bookshelf, ready to be sold. So I just always tell people, like, write. I mean, just write. Nobody's going to see it, and if you're really concerned about it, keep it in a private place or private computer, password protected, but just start to write and deal with the whole publishing aspect, as it happens. But speaking of publishing, and this is a question that I would want to all of you to answer, because I think we all have had very different paths to getting these books out to the public, whether that has involved an editor, whether it's involved an agent, whether it's involved publishing it yourself or going through a company, that helps authors publish the books. So what has that journey looked like for you? And maybe we'll just start reverse alphabetical this time. So Jonathan, do you want to talk a little bit about how you actually went about getting your books published?
Sure. So all the books I showed off here, the nonfiction ones, are all published by my company, which is Brick Pickle Media, and then Brick Pickle Pulp, as you mentioned earlier. And I've also, my process was that I kind of looked at various options, and it seemed to be with kind of the way publishing has changed so much that it really seemed to make the most sense for me. I've also worked on some of my fiction with some small publishers, and it just seems that from talking with them and their experience, that is really, and talking to other authors, there's so many challenges of trying to work with that dream people have, and I had too, that New York Times bestseller, I'm going to go work for get a big publisher, and that's just not realistic, and it's not, if it ever was, it's not the experience people have anymore. So, and certainly, you mentioned editors. definitely one of the biggest pieces of advice I'd have for someone: invest in an editor. I mean, I also edit books, and I'm a writer, I'm a journalist, but I don't trust myself to edit my own stuff because I'm going to miss things. So you got to invest in that, and whether it's for help from proofreading as well as just language and if it's fiction, you know, plot holes, but even in nonfiction, if there's something you left out because you knew this information, but somebody reads it and says, well, why did this happen? And you're like, oh, because of this. But you can't. So I think that editor role is really important for people to spend some time with.
Sure, thank you. Joy, how about you?
Yeah, I also had no illusions that my book would be the New York Times bestseller, but knew that the audience would be, you know, people in the Midwest. So I was looking at small presses, at university presses, regional kind of presses, that thing where I didn't need an agent because I thought, well, you know, that's just another step. And I feel like the presses I'm looking at, they wouldn't require that. So I sent out, you know, several presses, got several rejections, was starting to think, what do I do next? And then I found out that a friend of mine knew the publisher of Noden Press, and so I already had sent it to him. I hadn't heard back, and so she, you know, kind of gave him a nudge, and he had you know, he said send it again because, you know, I think people at the presses get so many submissions, and it's got to be just, you know, overwhelming. So he took a look at it, and so I was just really grateful because I was really hoping for a small press based in Minnesota or the, you know, the regional area, because I think that's where the main audience for it is. And I was really hoping that it would be a press that, you know, would help get it into libraries and into bookstores. I also, you know, I've done a lot of talks, and so I can reach an audience that way. But I think it just, for me, for the type of book it is, it felt like it was really important to have that that kind of publication path.
Sure, thank you. How about you, Mary?
Well, when I started, well, I wrote the book that I wrote while I'm still a reporter. I submitted to the University of Minnesota Press, and they took it. So that was published. But then after I decided I wanted to write for children, I thought, well, I've written for 20 years. I have a published book. How hard can this be? And it's really hard. It's really hard. And I tried to write fiction at that time, and I worked for, you know, years, and I couldn't do that. And I thought, well, I know I can write nonfiction, so I worked, you know, I worked, and I still have been working. And along the way, I joined the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, and I went to a conference there and didn't get anywhere, and then went to a second conference, and there was an agent there who said he was looking for a different kind of children's nonfiction. And it was a great big conference, and he was leaving and putting on his coat. And I guess because I've been a reporter, I was used to like buttoning hole people, and I used to stick the mic in their face, you know. And so I was like, can I just talk to you for a second? I've written this book. And he asked me a couple questions, like about the fairy ring. He said, did their parents know? And I said, no, because it would be a whole different story if their parents knew. It wouldn't be their hoax, it would be their parents. But he said, well, send it to me. I'll take a look at it. And so then he became my agent, and he was a fantastic agent. And he sold both books to Candlewick, a wonderful press, in not very much time. But that was after 5 years of writing and not getting anywhere. So, and then I loved my agent at Candlewick. She was great. So that's how I got it.
And great. And I love stories like that. I mean, the more writers that you talk to, the more you hear things like that, like be persistent, you know, be persistent.
Oh, yeah.
Don't be afraid to go up to that person and say, hey, because you just never know.
Well, and one of the things that I really like hearing on us on these children's book conferences is everybody telling their story about how it was so hard for them to get somewhere. Like Kwame Alexander, who's like this superstar of children's books, he'd written a novel in verse. He was a poet, you know, a Black man, a poet writing about a novel, and you know, he couldn't get anywhere with it, not anywhere. And then when he finally got it published, the first review on Goodreads said, "This book sucks." And then after that, the New York Times reviewed it. They said it was wonderful, and it was like, and he was off and running, you know. But it's an amazing read. And what my story was now enough years ago that everything has shifted. All bets are, I mean, off now. So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Phyllis, how about your journey?
Well, every project has had a different one. So I'm a hybrid author. Some books self-published, some books traditionally published. I think when I started in the business, when you worked with a publisher, there was a lot of marketing that the publisher did for the book. And that is no longer the case in most instances. You have to do the marketing yourself or a large share of it, but you're still making the same amount of money as you did back in the day when you didn't have to do all of that. So I don't write books to make money, but I like to break even. There's a joke around our house that my job is to lose money so that we can write it off the taxes. But I also feel like sometimes a project, you have a vision for the project, and if you can't find a publisher, you might have some nibbles, but they want you to change the vision for the whole thing. And if you feel a really strong loyalty to the vision, don't be afraid to pull back and do it and be true to your vision. That's what we did with The Emptiness of Our Hands. We had a publisher ready to take it. Actually, 2 projects they were going to take, and then they got into financial trouble. They sold out to a bigger publisher who sat on both projects and ultimately didn't do anything with them. And then the nibbles we had after that, they wanted us to change so much it would have just destroyed what we had in mind. So then we went the self-publishing route. And I'm glad that we did. It's now in its 3rd edition, and it has a life of its own, which is all you can hope for as a writer for your book. So I would just urge people, if you do a professional book, self-published book, it can be as good as any book from any publishing house. But it has to be professional. You need the editors, you need the creative designers to help you with it. And you have to educate yourself about your market and how to reach the market, or nobody will ever know it's there. It's something like 1 million books are published on Amazon every year. How is anybody going to know you're there? And don't put all your eggs in Amazon either, for all kinds of reasons. That's a whole other subject. But here's my 2 cents.
Thank you. And Christine, how about you?
Yeah, yes. Well, I also, had dreams as a New York Times bestseller. That didn't quite come to fruition, but I did try for several years, many years, to get an agent, and I'd get to where I'd, have engagement with them back and forth, and then no one would ever take a chance. And so anyway, decided finally to go the self-publishing route. And I worked with Wise, well, it's kind of quasi self-publishing. I worked with Wise Inc. Publishing in Minneapolis. So they were wonderful. But prior to even getting to Wise Inc., I also did hire a professional editor that helped me on a lot of like moving things around and content, not just proofreading, and then, proofreader. And then by the time I got to Wise Inc., it was ready for another editor. And, but they were wonderful with helping me with, finding a cover designer and then book design and all of that. So it was a good experience, but yeah. And knowing, and luckily I had worked in marketing and communication. So was, that wasn't too hard for me to do. It's still a lot of work, and, absolutely, to the earlier point about, you have to, you can't just put all your eggs in one basket, and Amazon is a whole different beast. But that's why these things like this are wonderful for independent authors and authors of all kinds, just because it is a great way to get out in the community and talk about books. And my experience, though, was great with Wise Inc. So happy how it turned out.
If I may throw out another resource, the Alliance for Independent Authors is a really good international organization that I would recommend. They have a lot of guidebooks and discounts and things. Just it's a great organization. And you know, the more you have to market on your own and stuff, the more threatened your creative time is. So, you know, I think you all might know what I'm talking about there. So I have to say, okay, my best writing time is in the afternoon. That's just the way I'm built. So these are going to be sacred hours for me. There's nothing else that goes on between these times. And so all the business end of my life has to go on in the morning. And it's really helpful, even if you can just give a half hour to your writing every day. Set that time aside and hang on to that, honor that no matter what.
For sure. Thank you. Well, we're going to wrap it up here and let people go on to the next panels that we have going on all day and on Sunday as well. But to leave us, I just want to go around really quick and just tell us where we can find you. If you have a website, if you have social media, what's the best way to find out more about you and your books? So Christine, if you want to let us know where the best place is to find you, and I'll make sure that this is typed out so people can look at the links as well.
Sure, absolutely. Yes, my website is authorcbauer.com, and my books can be ordered directly from my website. They are also available on Amazon. Social media, Facebook, I'm author Chris Bauer, and on Twitter, author Chris Bauer. Those are the main places I go, and my email address and all that is on my website as well. So happy to connect with people on any of those platforms.
Okay, thank you. And Phyllis?
PhyllisColdeye.com. There's no hyphen in that. And I do have an extensive store there, but you can get most of my books except the special orders almost anywhere. I'm on most social media platforms at Phyllis Coldeye. And if you subscribe to one of my mailing lists, there are 3 different free mailing lists that I have. You get a free sampler of my work in multiple genres, including music. And also you have the privilege then of joining my Facebook group, Coffee Break with Phyllis Coldeye. So I hope to see you there. Thanks for your interest in my work.
Yeah, good, thank you. How about you, Mary?
I have a website. It's www.marylozier.com, and you can email me through that website. I do tweet at @mlozier. Not much, really. I'm on Instagram. I should be able to remember my handle.
That's okay.
I can't right now. It's on my website. And I like it best if people buy my books from independent bookstores, and you can ask for them. And it's a big favor to an author, actually, to go or call up at this point an independent bookstore and order their book. But you can also order online through bookshop.com, which is the online organization of independent bookstores. So
Good, thank you.
Thank you for listening.
And Joy.
Thank you for having us.
Of course. How
My
about you,
website
Joy?
is joyriggs.com. I also have a blog that I haven't been too up to date with lately, but it's mymusicalfamily.blogspot.com, and I have a Facebook page, My Musical Family, and my book is available it's published by Norton Press, and they're distributed by Tasca Books, so you can get it at a variety of independent bookstores. I do have some links on my website to some ones that have been particularly supportive of me, and so I'd love to promote them if you want to buy it from them. It is, also available through Amazon and Barnes & Noble, but like Mary said, I love to support indie bookstores because they've been so generous to authors like me.
Really. And Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity today. My website is, again, it's the company, so it's brickpicklemedia.com. And then Facebook is also just facebook.com/brickpicklemedia. And you can find my books. I sell them directly through the website. You can, order, any bookstore can order them through Ingram, as well as, of course, they're available on Amazon, booksamillion.com, places like that. And of course, a good way to find all those links is look at our profiles on the Deep Valley website. So we've all got our links to the books there. So thank you.
Yep. You're welcome. Very, very easy to find. So thank you to all of you today. It was a wonderful conversation about all things nonfiction. I could really talk all day about it. So thank you so much. And thanks to all of you who are watching, and feel free to watch other panels throughout today and tomorrow. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.